Hi, I'm Daniel Burke. Welcome to EIR News Live. We're coming to you in a very important moment as we've had a very significant summit between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump. And this is an opportunity to bring about a world defined by the common aims of mankind. So we're going to give you a review of the EIR Daily Alert, which is a daily publication you can subscribe to for $10 a month at the link that's on the bottom of the screen here. And we'll give you some of the material in there. You can go and read the rest in depth. I'm here with Michelle Aaron. And after that, we have a remarkable interview, crucial discussion with a former UN drug official named Pino Arlacchi, in which he puts forth a very firm view. We can end the drug trade, so let's do it. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle for the lead to the briefing.
Great, thank you. So we have here the lead titled, Think the Higher One, the Destiny of Humanity to Solve Today's Crisis by Megan DeBroat. In the midst of a very fast-moving and increasingly tense and dangerous global strategic situation, Helga Zepp-LaRouche focused her international webcast of October 29th on the importance of the October 25th address by Pope Leo XIV, in which he singled out the revolutionary contributions of Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, especially Cusa's concept of the coincidence of opposites. In those October 25th remarks to tens of thousands of people in St. Peter's Square, the Pope said that Cusa lived in another troubled age, the 15th century, when many of his contemporaries lived in fear. Others took up arms, but Cusa believed in humanity. He understood that there are opposites which must be held together. So Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche said, I think it is, in my view, probably the most important strategic intervention, because what the Pope does is he elevates the discussion to a plane where the solution is possible. And I believe we have an excerpt from that.
I'm having a technical issue. Why don't you go ahead and read it, Michelle? Sorry about that.
Okay, so this excerpt that was enfolded into the lead, Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche highlighted Cusa's method of the coincidence of opposites as a method of thinking how you can avoid getting stuck in the nitty-gritties of this problem or that problem, but how you can train your mind to think the one. This is extremely important. The Pope applies it very clearly to the political situation, because obviously, if you look at every conflict in the world today, if you look at the situation in the Middle East or Ukraine or the Caribbean, if you look only at the facts, the history of the crisis, the tensions and the personalities involved, you will never find an adequate solution. But if you start totally the other way around, if you think the one first, in this case, the one humanity, which unites us all, and then from that elevated point of view, look at the concrete crisis, you can always find a solution. You can apply that method to any problem, to politics, economics, military issues, social issues, cultural issues, because it is a way of conflict resolution which does exactly that. That the hope of synthesizing the next step of the evolution of the development of mankind you can see something that does not exist, but which can be brought about by the people of goodwill by concerted efforts. So this is a very beautiful intervention. End quote. So that was from Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche. Continuing on our lead, Megan continues, beautiful and timely, as was observed by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in remarks to the third Minsk International Conference on Eurasian Security, quote, the militarization of European countries is gaining momentum. Military industrial funding is being increased. Large-scale exercises are being conducted, and logistics for the transfer of troops to the Eastern Front are being improved, utilizing the infrastructure of countries not part of the North Atlantic Alliance, end quote. The logical ending of the policy of the NATO warmongers infected with the ideology of geopolitics is nuclear war. In the International Peace Coalition meeting of October 24th, Professor Ted Postel laid out in terrifyingly stark terms what would happen to the human population in the event of a nuclear war. The momentum of the current system must not be allowed to carry humanity towards such a final destination. What we must enter instead is a vision of a different kind of future for humankind, one cut from a completely different cloth than today's failed system. Today, October 30th, President Donald Trump will meet with President Xi Jinping, a dialogue which the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman identified as decisive for relations between the two nations, saying, quote, heads of state diplomacy plays an irreplaceable role in providing strategic guidance for China-U.S. relations, end quote. Such meetings between heads of state, as was seen in the August summit in Alaska between Presidents Trump and Vladimir Putin, can set up processes in motion which are not a logical outgrowth of current policy. Civilizations collapse, or not, based on whether a culture, a people, is capable of discarding its flawed, sometimes tragic axioms of belief and adopting a solution which was seemingly impossible before. Solutions are on the table. An agreement between Russia, China, and the United States to build the Bering Strait Tunnel could fundamentally shift the strategic landscape and create an opening for lasting peace. The Oasis Plan, centered in Palestine and Israel, could provide a viable and beautiful future for the entire Southwest Asia region. We today must seize the opportunity of the strategic intervention of Cusa's coincidence of opposites to shift the political dialogue to that higher one, the destiny of humankind over the next millennium, the higher plane on which the solutions to today's extraordinarily perilous situation reside. All right, and I'll turn it back to Daniel to help us get some of the slugs, some of the background needed for us to create that upshift.
Thank you, Michelle. One of the things we're doing is we're featuring the EIR publication, and we've discussed a lot the Daily Alert, which is the daily briefing that we're bringing to you, but there's also a weekly magazine, which I highly, highly recommend you read if you want to understand things in depth. And so in describing our new edition of this, which I'm going to show you here in a moment, we've got, take a look at the new issue of EIR Weekly just released yesterday. Here's what Stuart Battle had to say about it. Title of this issue is Consolidating Peace by Connecting the World. The October 31st issue of EIR Weekly has been released, featuring a package on the needed policy of peace through development and how this could be manifest in both Israel-Palestine as well as between the United States and Russia. We include a feature interview with Ambassador Professor Dr. Manuel Hassassian, the Palestinian Authority's ambassador to Denmark, conducted by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder of the Schiller Institute. During the interview, Ambassador Hassassian praises the LaRouche Oasis plan, saying, "This is the right time to promote it." We also publish an article about last week's breakout EIR seminar. The Bering Strait Tunnel project can open a new era of peace through development, including the keynote address by Helga Zepp-LaRouche. On the subject of the rising significance of the global majority, this issue of EIR includes an in-depth analysis of some of the recent mega projects being built in Africa, from a major national railroad grid in Nigeria to a newly christened dam in Ethiopia, the largest on the continent. The issue concludes with a delightful short article by Lyndon LaRouche, an excerpt of remarks he made in 1996 in Moscow in dialogue with Russian scientists. LaRouche describes the actual metric for measuring economic progress: mankind himself. We have a slug from Gretchen Small. Chinese and Japanese foreign ministers discuss improving relations. And I have here one of the news reports on that. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Japanese Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi spoke by telephone today for a half hour, their first conversation since Motegi was reappointed foreign minister by newly inaugurated Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. The reports on the call given by both nations concur that both governments seek to improve relations and resolve differences. Quote, Minister Motegi stated that as the international situation changes significantly, the responsibilities that both China and Japan bear have grown substantially. The two foreign ministers confirmed that they share a broad direction of comprehensively promoting a mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interests and building constructive and stable Japan-China relations, according to the Japanese Foreign Ministry. It added that the two foreign ministers confirmed that they would reduce issues and concerns and increase mutual understanding of cooperation under this broad direction, and agreed on the importance of having communication at various levels, including between the leaders and foreign ministers. And you can see from this news report, it's widely being interpreted as an indication that Xi Jinping may have a meeting with Prime Minister Takaichi, which would be quite an important development, especially coming out of today's meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping. I'm going to turn it back to Michelle for another couple of slugs. Here we go.
The question of the relations between Russia and some of the nations in that area and the West. Lavrov warns of expansion of nuclear armaments in Western Europe. By Bill Jones. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov answered media questions following his speech at the plenary session of the Third Minsk International Conference on Eurasian Security on October 28th. He underlined in particular the efforts by the Western European powers to beef up their nuclear arsenals, with attempts by France and Great Britain to combine their nuclear arsenals, and even discussions of Germany possessing nuclear weapons. He said, in July 2025, France and Great Britain agreed to coordinate their nuclear forces by creating an Entente Cordiale-like framework for designing missile systems. The Germans signed an agreement with the UK, which basically amounts to establishing military cooperation. And in recent days, we have been hearing calls coming from London to add a nuclear dimension to this military cooperation between the UK and Germany. The militarization of Europe is gaining traction with more funding for defense manufacturers, large-scale exercises, and efforts to perfect logistics for moving troops to the so-called Eastern Front by using the infrastructure of countries which are not part of NATO. Lavrov noted also, and Bill Jones points out that there were similar comments also by Belarus's President Alexander Lukashenko on this matter. Lavrov said that the previous security arrangements on the European continent have totally fallen apart. He said they planned and provoked the conflict in Ukraine, which dealt a final blow to the Euro-Atlantic security model, which used to rely on NATO, the OSCE, and the European Union. Over the past 8 years, the EU evolved into a Euro-Atlantic component of this setting. Today, there are voices coming from Europe about building a new European security system. But having floated this idea, they instantly add that there is no place for Russia and Belarus within this framework. End quote. So that's how Lavrov understands the situation. He also pointed to the beginnings of the Ukraine crisis in the broken promises of the West not to expand NATO. Not only has NATO expanded, Lavrov noted, but this purely defensive alliance, in quotes, air quotes, purely defensive alliance is now spreading its tentacles to the Asia-Pacific region and to regions surrounding Russia to create new areas of conflict and tension for Russia. He also lambasted the European efforts to undermine any attempts by the U.S. to mediate a peace settlement in Ukraine. As he said, it is the European members of NATO that are prolonging the armed conflict in Ukraine by funneling weapons into the Kiev regime and providing it with financial and political support. Most European leaders are at pains to persuade the U.S. administration against the idea of reaching a settlement in Ukraine by eliminating the root causes of the conflict at the negotiating table. We hope that U.S. President Donald Trump remains sincere about his aspiration to resolve the Ukrainian crisis and will persevere in adhering to the principles developed at the summit in Anchorage, the principles founded on America's proposals. End quote from Lavrov. He points out that the Arctic, intended to serve as the ideal region for global cooperation, is also being brought into the war policy of the West. If you wish to read yourself in the Slug, it notes several organizations among nations that have a potential to be part of an improved global security situation. We're going to move now to Southwest Asia. As many have likely heard of the renewed strikes, you might say, or continued strikes on Gaza by the IDF. Gretchen Small gives us IDF's latest airstrikes on Gaza. The Nazis had a ratio for retributive killings too. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered heavy IDF airstrikes on Gaza 2 nights ago, killing 104 people at last report, 46 of them children. The order was given in retribution for an unknown sniper having killed one IDF soldier in Gaza on October 28th. When this IDF rampage ended, Netanyahu then declared that the ceasefire is back on. U.S. President Donald Trump justified the IDF strike. He said, "They killed an Israeli soldier, so the Israelis hit back, and they should hit back." He told reporters on Air Force One, as reported by Times of Israel. Now, U.S. Representative Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, who is a strong MAGA supporter, except when President Donald Trump's policies cross her basic values, posted on her X account on October 29th. Israel's military said Wednesday that the ceasefire was back on in Gaza after it killed 104 people, including 46 children, according to local health officials. 46 children? Are these not war crimes? That was the X post. Gretchen continues, she is right. These are war crimes. War crimes similar to the notorious Nazi practice of setting reprisal ratios for how many people, prisoners, enemies, etc., in their prisons or camps or in occupied territories should be killed for every Nazi soldier or official killed or wounded. The ratios varied from 100 killed for the death of one Nazi soldier and 50 for one wounded, to entire villages, sometimes thousands of people, killed in retribution for any attack on Nazi forces. The comparison is likely not mere coincidental. Let it not be forgotten that on January 25th, 2002, Israeli journalist Amir Oren reported in Haaretz Daily that the IDF had been studying the methods the Nazis used in 1943 to exterminate the Jewish resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, not to ensure that it would not happen ever again to Jews, but rather for Israel to use those same methods against Palestinians. When EIR questioned the press spokesman for then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, this press spokesman was Raanan Gisson, when questioned by EIR about this horrifying revelation, Gisson replied without shame that, quote, some officers may have been looking at that. They thought that it was similar because you would be fighting street by street against the Palestinian Authority, end quote. So that's the latest on that. Back to Daniel. Bit louder, Daniel.
Okay, I'm going to get better at that. Mexican farmers reject token increase in corn price. Nationwide protests continue. This is by, okay, I'm going to figure that out too. This is by Gretchen Small as well. Negotiations between the Mexican government, corn growers, and representatives of the corn milling industry collapsed this past Monday, October 27, when the industry reps and the Secretary of Agriculture set a price for corn which does not come anywhere near covering the farmers' costs of production. Farmers have been mobilizing for weeks to get the government to adopt a series of measures to save Mexico's independent farmers by freeing staple grains from the grip of speculators, provide needed credits, ensure adequate management, and so forth. Under today's cartel-dictated conditions, Mexico's farmers, like their counterparts in the United States, are going bankrupt in large numbers. Monday's negotiations were focused on setting a parity price for white corn. The farmers need 7,200 pesos per ton to keep farming. The milling industry offered 5,800 a ton. Secretary of Agriculture Julio Sacristan accepted the latter proposal, with a token addition announcing that farmers would get 6,050 pesos. That is 20% below what farmers require to keep producing. The corn growers from Mexico's Central Valley states, who represented the national farmers in these negotiations, walked out and angrily informed supporters rallied outside that the negotiations had failed, and nationwide protests, blocking highways and so forth, would immediately resume. The National Front to Save the Mexican Countryside, FNRCM, which has been leading the fight, dubbed the Ag Secretary as Secretary for Chicago's Speculative Exchange. 6,050 pesos a ton, quote, will lead to more bankruptcies and loan defaults in a Mexican countryside that is on the brink of collapse with accumulated losses over recent years, the FNRCM charged. The Agriculture Secretary defended 6,050 pesos per ton as a great offer because it is 25% above international prices. Yes, the FNRCM responded, but domestic production costs have skyrocketed in relation to the prices set by the Chicago Speculative Exchange controlled by the large agro-financial corporations. And that is precisely why the farmers insist that, quote, Mexican agriculture and its staple crops cannot continue to be tied to the speculative Chicago Stock Exchange imposed by the USMCA trade agreement, which robs domestic producers of their income, causes entire segments of the food market to be lost, and weakens the country's sovereignty by deepening its dependence on food imports. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has been questioned about the farm protests in every morning press conference this week. She acknowledged on Monday that the price of grains fell sharply this year and is expected to decline further next year. When the war in Ukraine began, a ton of corn cost more than 7,000 pesos, but now it is around 3,200 pesos. So it is a huge decrease, which obviously affects domestic producers. The government is looking to provide them with support, but also to work on a longer-term proposal that is not only subject to the ups and downs of the market, is neither subject to the ups and downs of the market nor the international price of corn, she added. Now, take a look at what the British establishment may have to say about these meetings happening in China. Brits fret that China is focused on technological advance, not GDP. Britain's think tank Chatham House, otherwise known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, is upset. China's just concluded fourth plenum of the Communist Party made clear that in its upcoming 2026 to 2030 5-year plan, this plan will be anchored on technological self-reliance as the driver of the economy, jettisoning focuses on GDP and consumption levels, which obsess British monetarists. You can see, I have a screenshot here of the Chatham House article. Quote, this is from the article, since the founding of the People's Republic, each 5-year plan has served as the backbone of Beijing's policy direction. The plans have outlined not just where the leadership intends to steer the economy, but also how it wants to shape China's place in the world. Dr. Yu Jie, Senior Research Fellow on China for Chatham House Asia Pacific program, acknowledges in his evaluation of the plan. Quote, judging from the published communiqué from the meeting, the key themes from the upcoming 5-year plan signal a clear break from every plan since the reform and opening up era began under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping in 1978. It marks the final consolidation of the shift to use technology as the main driver of the economy. The days of single-mindedly chasing nominal GDP growth are firmly a thing of the past, he moans. Yu views this as a decisive shift in China's growth model, which aims toward building a resilient economy anchored in domestic innovation and fortified manufacturing supply chains capable of weathering, as the communiqué puts it, even dangerous storms. Thus, global economists, by which he means London, who were hoping for a renewed focus on domestic consumption domestic consumption efforts to revive China's sluggish property market or grant more financial autonomy to local governments, will be disappointed. China has instead adopted an intense focus on addressing technological choke points. Says Gretchen, this is a good time for the world to start laughing at the British. Yu suggests flanks, which London can use to somehow stop China's development, even this late in the game. There's only one problem, however. They are promised on the deeply held imperial assumption that human beings are only in it for themselves, in one long Hobbesian war of one against all, and a vehement refusal to admit that there are no limits to man's economic development and growth. So you forecast that China's development will be threatened when emerging economies adopt China's development model, because they'll seek to develop their own industries rather than rely on Beijing. Likewise, he worries that to make advanced manufacturing the main engine of growth without dragging overall economic expansion to levels that erode household wealth is a balancing act so delicate that it suggests it might topple the Chinese state. How? Yu assumes that technological advance eliminates jobs, and therefore China's younger generation will lack employment, and that, he enthusiastically forecasts, will bring about social strife. Quote, since its inception 100 years ago, the Chinese Communist Party has survived by managing its contradictions. Maybe, he hopes, the contradiction between economic security and economic growth will finally test the durability of China's political model. So there you have it. The British are extremely worried about a commitment to physical economic development based on breakthroughs in science and technology. Exactly the approach to physical economy that the founder of EIR, Lyndon LaRouche, proposed and fought for his entire life. So that's what we have there. I'm going to go ahead and return it to Michelle, who's going to conclude our briefing, and then we'll go from there to the interview. So let me just handle this properly. Okay, go right ahead.
All right, we have the question of technology from a different nation here. A comment from Vladimir Putin of Russia on the Burevestnik missile, that he spoke to servicemen during a visit to the Mandraika military hospital a couple of days ago, October 29th, speaking that this missile, that the technology has economic and scientific applications. So it's a nuclear-powered cruise missile, and there was just on October 21st a successful test flight of the missile. They also tested the Poseidon nuclear-powered underwater drone. So Putin here is addressing the broader economic and scientific implications of this military weapon. He said, we will be able to use it not only in defense, but also in the national economy, including in solving the issue of energy supply in the Arctic and the lunar exploration program. Even now, radiation-protected electronics developed for the Burevestnik missile are being used in space programs. Thus, this breakthrough strengthens both Russia's defense capability and the overall scientific and industrial potential for the future. Okay, so and that was written by Megan DeBroat. So Russia also clearly has a mind towards technological advancement and how that affects even the whole population of their country.
Things are looking up. So let's go ahead to the, thank you very much, Michelle. And we will we'll be ending this show at this moment. So make sure that you get onto the daily alert. And then finally, we're going to show you this remarkable interview with Dr. Pino Arlacchi. He is a former official of the United Nations. You'll get a full introduction to him from Dennis Small, our representative, who interviewed him recently. Please enjoy this. The key idea is that we can actually end the drug trade in the world. We can shut down the City of London's Dope Incorporated, and here's how to do it. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Dennis Small from Executive Intelligence Review. Today is October 24th, and I have the pleasure of having with me for a discussion Professor Pino Arlacchi. He was the Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the well-known UNODC, from 1997 to 2002. Prior to that, in the 1990s, he was a member of parliament in Italy, was part of the Anti-Mafia Commission, is an expert on the subject of fighting drugs, stopping the drug trade. From 2009 to 2014, he was a member of the European Parliament. And in 2010, he was the rapporteur for the European Parliament on the subject of Afghanistan. And this is a matter of great relevance to what we want to discuss today. Today, he is a full professor of sociology at the University of Sassari, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Welcome, Professor Arlacchi.
Happy to be here and talk about the usual issues that are still, unfortunately, very hot.
Unfortunately, indeed. I just saw a report this morning that yesterday, according to press accounts, there were two B-1B bombers of the United States flying from Texas that flew within 50 miles of the Venezuelan coast to the east of Caracas. This was about a week after there were three B-52s that flew over the Caribbean north of Caracas. In addition to this flexing of muscles, President Trump yesterday said that he perhaps will talk to the Senate, but no, I don't think we're going to necessarily ask for a declaration of war. I think we're going to kill people that are bringing drugs to our country. Okay, we're going to kill them, you know, they're going to be like dead. And then he said, after these maritime operations, the land is going to be next. Incidentally, those maritime operations, as of this morning, are 9 strikes, 9 boats sunk, presumably with drugs on them, but there's no absolute proof of that. 37 people dead. What is your reading of this, and what is your perspective on how this drug problem should be actually addressed, Professor Arlacchi?
Well, I am simply shocked by this behavior that shows a total disrespect of international law and basic rules of international community, and also the strategy to fight narcotics. No state applied and applies death penalty for the narcotic trade, consumption, trafficking, and all the rest. It's just Mr. Trump decided that. First. Second, is clearly evident that the issue of narcotics is not at stake in these operations. It's very evident that at stakes in the case of Venezuela is the issue of dominate Venezuela because of its oil. So Mr. Trump is applying a strategy of colonizing, submitting this country, because this country has a government that does not allow its resources, national resources, to be exploited from other countries. The oil industry of Venezuela belongs to the government, so it's clear that they want the United States wants to have a stake or completely own the oil industry through force, violence, and through a kind of regime change done by the people, Venezuela, agents of the United States that are trying to overthrow Maduro government.
Yes, I think this regime change aspect is quite evident, and perhaps the naming of the Nobel Peace Prize for this year, Maria Corina Machado of Venezuela, was perhaps intended to encourage that process, and she very much supports the Trump policy for the region. I would venture to add that in addition to the oil matter, Trump has been unfortunately very explicit in his attacks on the role of the BRICS and the role of China and its economic role in helping Ibero-America develop. And perhaps that's also an aspect of targeting any country that wants to work with anybody other than Wall Street and the City of London. Would you say that that's a factor as well?
Yes, I mean, I read the issue through an internal issue in the United States, which is the clash between Trump and the so-called deep state. Deep state is strongly against the use of force against Venezuela. It already under Biden opposed the idea of overthrowing the government of Maduro through Mr. Guaido. Because of a very clear evaluation, it was clearly crazy to do this operation with a person like Guaido and with a strategy like the one Guaido did and failed. This Machado story is a repetition of Guaido issue, with the addition that in this case, the clear goal is to have Maduro destroyed, and the issue of oil is very clear. The most important point of Mrs. Machado plan is to privatize Venezuelan oil industry, and of course giving this industry to the American oil companies. This strategy will fail as Guaido's attempt failed, for clear reason. The only way to put Maduro aside is to invade Venezuela. And Trump is not going to invade Venezuela because deep state is deeply against that. He's trying anyway to do provocations, to do this attempt to overthrow Maduro through these land interventions against narcotics. And I believe it will not succeed, because the most important element is that Venezuelan people are reacting in an extremely strong way. And this is very known to intelligence agencies, right, and to everybody. Trump action is strengthening Maduro's appeal to the population. There is now a popular militia. There are 8 million people mobilized. I was there recently and I saw them.
Yes.
8 million people that do regular exercise every week in order to counter a possible attack to Venezuela in the form of invasion or in the form of a kind of team of people who will land in Venezuela trying to get rid of Maduro. So with an opposition like this, with a mobilization like this, is impossible to conduct a successful golpe operation. Government Venezuela is staying very calm in its reaction. They never arrested Machado, like they did not arrest Guaido, even if their violations are clearly would deserve in any democratic state, or even not democratic, a strong reaction, because it's a subversion. It's an open subversion. You cannot, like Mrs. Machado does every day, say, ask for an armed foreign intervention in your own country.
Yeah, right. You
cannot organize golpe and assassination of the president of your country. You cannot pursue this clear strategy on behalf of a foreign power. Just to give you an example, a few years ago in Europe, there was a movement and a party in Spain that pursued the independence of Catalonia, a Spanish region, from the central government. It was a movement entirely political, entirely peaceful, that got very big support by almost 90% of the Catalonia population through a referendum. The reaction of the central state of Spain to this movement was to arrest the heads of the movement and to use violence, repressing peaceful demonstration in order to just cancel the political effect of the movement. This is Spain is not a dictatorship. Spain is a fully democratic state. And the way they reacted is an example of the way almost every European country would react to a similar political attack.
Right. Yeah.
This is the way, just to give you the proportion of what Mrs. Machado is doing. My opinion is a paradox, is that the government is letting her hide, knowing exactly where she is, because the perception is that she, at the end of the story, would help the government to get more consensus in the population, in a moment in which there is a huge consensus behind the government. So all these actions by Machado, Trump, and so on, at the end of the story, are strengthening the current government of Venezuela.
I would like to add also that the Maduro government in Venezuela has been fairly insightful in warning President Trump to not make this mistake, because it could be the policies of Marco Rubio that are just going to bloody the hands of Trump. So they are wisely, in my view, looking at the differences of especially the neocon crowd that for a long time, like around Guaido, were going for this. One of those, John Bolton, is now facing some legal difficulties of his own, but we'll leave that discussion for another time. I am aware that you were in Venezuela recently, Professor Arlacchi, and one of the things that you said there, among the many, which, or in articles afterwards, which I wanted to raise with you, is you said the whole idea of the Cartel de los Soles, which purportedly Maduro is part of, is a total myth. You said the 2025 UNODC report, again for our viewers, the UNODC is the body which Professor Arlacchi headed for many years. But the latest report is crystal clear and should embarrass those who have demonized Venezuela through rhetoric. The report only briefly mentions Venezuela, stating that a small amount of Colombian drug production passes through the country en route to the United States and Europe. And then you specify only 5% of Colombian drugs transit through Venezuela. Colombia produces over 70% of the world's cocaine. Peru and Bolivia cover most of the remaining 30%. Now, I'm going to put a map on the screen for our viewers, which is a map which Executive Intelligence Review produced or reprinted a number of years ago as part of a study on the drug trade, which we did. And I'm going to ask you to comment on it. The data which I'm showing you here actually only go to 2019, which was the last time we completed the study, about 5 years ago. I dare say that this trend is continuing. We viewed Dope Inc., as we called it, the world drug cartel centered in financial interests, as $1.5 trillion worth in potential street volume of sales, rising rapidly. This is the trend of cocaine, and our numbers in 2019 match exactly what you said about the preponderant role of Colombia today. Not surprising, since the studies that we did used statistics from the UNODC and from the major United States report, which is the INCSR, the International Narcotics control
Yeah.
strategy report, which match fairly closely, but we checked one against the other. But here's the map I wanted to show our viewers and to ask you about. Again, this is from 2019, but at the time it does show that 74% of the cocaine entering the United States was going through the Pacific, not through the Caribbean. Of course, there is a problem in the Caribbean, but most of it was going to Mexico and crossing the border into the United States. I would also add that 80% or so of the drugs trafficked into the United States did not come from illegal aliens swimming across the Rio Grande. It came through the official checkpoints, through the major cities, in trucks, in cars, and in other ways. So I wanted to show this map and ask you your professional opinion. You've studied this for decades. What is going on at this point in terms of these trafficking routes?
Yeah, this is a fairly reliable picture shared by not only the UN program against drugs, but by basically all drug control agencies in the world. The European Union publish every year a report on the European market for narcotics, and the EU is the second largest market in the world, where all traffickers send and trade narcotics. And it says basically what the UN is saying. It never mentions Venezuela, mentions this route, that are the Pacific route for cocaine, and the Balkan routes for opium coming from Afghanistan. There is no mention of Venezuela. Even other countries that do their own narcotic reports and analysis every year, there is not a single country that says that Venezuela plays a significant role. Even the American sources, until 1 year ago or 2 years ago, there was no mention whatsoever of Venezuela as a major producers or dealer of narcotics, or Venezuelan officials linked to any significant organized crime organization or that play a significant role in drug trafficking. This is a complete invasion by Mr. Rubio and Mr. Trump. All their own agencies do not corroborate this picture. And on the issue of political corruption and organized crime, there was in March this year a report by intelligence community, the U.S. intelligence community, that says that basically there is no whatsoever connection of high political figures in Venezuela and these strange names, Cartel do Sol and others, that are criminal organizations in Venezuela. These are not significant organizations. These are just a bunch of small criminals that do some local trafficking in something, and there was never, and there does not exist any connection with the political and with the government. There is a fight between the government and the organized crime in Venezuela, even involved in narcotics and so on. They do a quite decent job in fighting these issues, both organized crime and the drug trafficking. So there is not a small single piece of evidence in supporting this pretension. The issue, as we said before, is oil, not narcotics. If narcotics would be an issue, they maybe could target Ecuador, who is now one of the main trafficking mediator between Latin America and Europe. But they don't talk about Ecuador. even if in Europe there was a full ship, plenty of cocaine coming from Ecuador with a partnership in the ownership of this ship by the president, the current president of Ecuador, who is a maritime entrepreneur, controls basically the most important port in Venezuela.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence.
Not a single word on it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Then
I've seen a lot of evidence on Noboa, president of Ecuador, too.
And then they tried to involve Colombia in all this issue, but Colombia is a country that produces and traffic cocaine since more than 30, 40 years. Why now? They discovered suddenly that Colombia is, that the president of Colombia is directly involved, like Maduro and all the others. These are just a pretext.
I've always thought, Professor Arlacchi, that if they really wanted to target the drug trade, the best thing to do would be to go after the banks in the City of London and in Wall Street that launder millions and billions of dollars of drug money. That is absolutely not touched. And
not only this, but the American banks.
Yeah.
Miami is the center of money laundering.
Okay, good. I want to get into this issue because in what you've said, you've pretty well discredited the cover story that's being used around this. I want to get to the question of why, the real why behind this, and of course the issue of solutions, because I know you're a man of solutions that remains very active today in working on this problem. For those who are viewing this, this is an EIR interview with Professor Pino Arlacchi, the former director of the UNODC and a longtime and ongoing activist in the war against the drug trade. Maybe I shouldn't use the word war, but efforts to stop the drug trade. So what I would like to do, Professor Arlacchi, if I may, is to ask the question, okay, why? What's really behind this? And I want to mention two developments to you, if I may. One, in 2012, in Senate hearings in the United States, the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired by Senator Levin, they issued a 335-page case history documenting in detail the role of many banks, but in particular, the London headquartered HSBC Bank, which you're familiar with, formerly Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, when it was based in Hong Kong, when Hong Kong was a British colony. Now it's HSBC. And they documented tens of billions of dollars, at least, of money laundering of money from the Sinaloa cartel. What happened next was interesting. In December of 2012, the United States Justice Department refused to prosecute HSBC, and they entered into a deferred prosecution agreement, what's known as a DPA. This was under Attorney General Eric Holder, and what he stated about why the Department of Justice would not be pressing charges against HSBC was that if this were done, it would provoke a crisis in the entire financial system. This became known as the Holder Doctrine, about why you can't touch these banks because the entire financial system is dependent on this money. This has been an issue raised by your successor, Antonio Maria Costa at the UNODC, by the Russia's former director of their anti-drug program, Viktor Ivanov. What is your view of this relationship between drug money laundering and the actual drug trade?
My view is that is a blatant exaggeration in saying that prosecuting HSBC, the entire financial system would collapse, so would be severely damaged. That's absolutely nonsense. There is a lot of money laundering. This is a very important international banks, and there would be no whatsoever risk of collapse of the entire financial system. It is a big bank, of course, and so on, but it's just a part, not particularly significant, of the entire issue of money laundering and the financial stability. Drug money goes through a process of money laundering and recycling, but is not the major component of international financial system. The major component of their dirty money is political corruption, but most of all is tax evasion by big multinational corporations and the issue of tax haven that is linked to it. So number one, illegal money, dirty money, is money laundering, is tax evasion by big corporation. Number two is corruption by political authorities. And number three is criminal money, mafia money. But in the political view, and also in the imagination of most people, is probably the opposite, the hierarchy between these three things. This is the first thing. The second is, along with the issue of oil, Venezuelan oil, which is a real issue at stake, there is also another issue, which is hiding the biggest drug problem that is in the United States, which is fentanyl consumption, is opioids consumption, which is really today a tragedy that is upsetting all figures on drug consumption all over the world. We have now this opioid boom that continues, that kills every year 100,000 Americans. That is an American issue, because this market of fentanyl and oxycodone and the similar anti-pain drugs was entirely created by pharmaceutical companies, American pharmaceutical companies, that legalized de facto narcotics in the United States.
Right.
This is organized crime, but no one would define organized crime in action like this. We have now in the United States almost 10 million people consuming fentanyl, oxycodone issue. That after the reaction of American institutions and people that sued this company quite successfully, they created a kind of a shortage of this pharmaceutical product in the market. And this shortage was filled by international organized crime. Mexican cartels learned how to produce fentanyl illegally, and now they sell it in the United States, but it is not the main supplier in the market. This is a very uncomfortable issue because it involves a very large population of the United States that is very sensitive to addiction.
Right.
Many former veteran soldiers that fought wars abroad, that are now many millions in the United States. It's almost overall, they reach 6-7% of the population that are very sensitive.
Yeah, absolutely.
To get addicted. So no one wants to talk about it. So from time to time, New York Times does an investigation, but there is no proportion between the seriousness of this phenomenon and the political extension of it. No one cares about this issue. And so it's very, but it is a big issue. So it is much, much easier to say that we have opiates and cocaine problem. Much easier to say that the small amount of fentanyl coming from abroad comes from Mexico or even from China, They invented a diversion to hide this issue that is just American.
Yeah.
In Europe, we do not have this fentanyl intoxication yet. And I am fairly confident that there will not be, because of issue of regulation, of issue of even doctors in Europe and hospitals that do not share the view of American doctors and so on, that prescribe fentanyl, oxycodone, and similar.
Well, I certainly
products.
hope you're right about that, Professor Arlacchi. The when one looks in depth behind this, one finds, in our view at EIR, and we've written a book on this called Dope Incorporated, that there is a large transnational, multinational, financial, and dirty money operation promoting the drug trade actively, a kind of new opium war. But the extent of this problem in the United States of fentanyl that you were mentioning, I think is, in one sense, even unknown to most Americans. The United Nations put out a report on this recently, and I'll just read a couple of statistics which give a horrifying picture of this. They report that 500,000 people died of drug-related deaths in 2019. Over the course of the entire 21st century to date, close to 10 million human beings have been lost to drugs. Based on that, the United Nations further calculates something that they call healthy life years lost due to drugs. And in 2019 alone, that translated into 18 million life years lost. Over the course of the 21st century, we have lost about 600 million potentially productive life years. So this gives some sense of the extent of the tragedy.
Look, the only historical
Question.
precedence is China. China in 19th century got a mass intoxication that can be compared to what is happening today in the United States.
Right.
But
Through the opium wars.
Yes, that intoxication ended drastically in just 3 years with the Chinese Revolution, and never came back.
Right.
But in the United States, as you say, there's no awareness of that, because there is a lack of basic information about it. There's no political discussion on it, and it's a tragedy that is destroying an entire sector of the American population, which is already degraded. It is already almost physically destroyed. The degradation, the physical degradation of part of the American population, the poorest, or the marginals, the veterans, is a huge problem without any any possibility to compare it in other countries.
Question: is legalization a solution?
Is the American case that shows that there is no solution. It's not a solution, because the most powerful drugs are these opiates. Fentanyl is 30, 50 times more powerful and dangerous than heroin. And now is basically legal in the United States. Not today, but since 10 years, it was not a crime to produce or traffic or sell or use fentanyl, the opiates. So it's illegal. It's a legal drug, sold regularly and so on. What was the result? 10 million people addicted, and the numbers that you just quoted, the biggest intoxication for narcotics in the history, which are entirely legal.
Yeah.
So I never been a prohibitionist. I always thought that we have to deal with drug demand, with drug reduction, policies and so on, even distributing heroin not freely, but under medical control to the people. We have methadone, which is a drug that is regularly distributed in Europe and also the United States to people under medical control, and other measures, and drug policies that have been effective in Europe today. We have half the addicts that we got 15 years ago, half of it. And in some countries, they are rapidly decreasing and almost disappearing. There are now all the people, old in the sense that are more than 40 years old in most European countries, and there is no attraction by narcotics to new generation. So these patient, long-term demand control policies worked in Europe. No country in Europe you have a serious problem of heroin addiction anymore. There is the risk now of opiates coming from the United States. This pain reduction medicine.
Yeah.
These are
Hydrocodone, Oxycontin.
But fortunately, up to now, even because of the American example, there are no tendencies to have a new European market like it occurred with the cocaine 30 years ago, in which it started in the United States and then extended to Europe. For the moment, we do not have this risk.
Right. Well, my final question has to do with what do we do? How do we deal with this? I want to just to bolster what you were saying about how legalization doesn't work. This is a graphic which we produced again back in 2019. This is the case of marijuana, but I think the case applies across the board to all the drugs. When you lower the price, and in part by legalization and so on, the result is you increase the quantity produced and consumed. And I graphed this against the political policy of first decriminalization in the 80s and 90s, then medical use, and now full recreational legalization. And of course, what's happened is it's gone up and up and up. It doesn't solve the problem. Now, many people say, Professor Arlacchi, well, nothing can be done. There is one graph which I know you are very familiar with, since you did this or were involved in doing this with the government of Afghanistan and are still involved in this. But for those who say it can't be done, this is a graph that you're seeing on the screen here of the trajectory of the, let me get the exact units that we used here. It's a familiar graph. This is tons of production of opium equivalent. Sometimes heroin, sometimes opium. And of course, Afghanistan has historically been the primary producer. And you see this incredible drop in this 2000-2001 period, down to zero from Afghanistan.
Yes, I did that.
This kind of disproves the argument that says, well, you can't do anything about it. You may as well surrender. You were involved. How was it done? And what do you suggest be done today?
When I joined the United Nations, I started to work on the production of opium. That at that time was the main issue for European consumers, addicts, and so on. 95%, and even today, of European opium comes from Afghanistan. And I was struck by the fact that in Afghanistan, opium production was, in economic terms, quite small. It was a very small phenomenon. Was just a couple of tens of $1 million. So strategically, it was much better and much more effective to try to end up with the production of opium in Afghanistan, which was extracted by poppy cultivation.
Mm-hmm.
So I mobilized the resources of the United Nations and also the member states who contributed to it in order to create alternative productions to opium. The Taliban at the time were in power, just arrived in power, and I used stick and carrot policy with them, convincing them that international community could provide the resources, alternative resources to create alternative to the opium cultivation. They initially balked a bit, they tried, then I used stronger arguments until in the year 2001, first of all, we obliged them prohibit the cultivation of opium poppy, promising them alternative resources, money. It was at that time around it can seem very small, but with $200 million a year for 5 years, we could completely phase out the production of opium poppy in Afghanistan. I mean, a market that in Europe was almost $50 billion. Mm-hmm. First, we prohibited the production. We wrote the opium ban for the government of Afghanistan, but for the Taliban. And at a certain point, after 2 years, they really implemented it. They prohibited the cultivation effectively. So there was no cultivation of opium poppy in the year 2001 in Afghanistan. 95 reduction. But the same year, October of that year, Afghanistan was invaded by USA. And the first thing that Mr. Rumsfeld did personally is to make a set of agreements with the warlords of Afghanistan who controlled the production of narcotics, telling them that the USA would turn its head the other way around in exchange of their support in the fight, the so-called fight against terrorism, which was a terrorism managed by the same people of the agreement. So the following year, production skyrocketed all over Afghanistan. And then during American occupation, no one cared about the elimination of opium cultivation. So they continued, Afghanistan farmers and traffickers, to poison Europe, particularly. The United States was much less affected because heroin in the United States came from Southeast Asia, came from Myanmar. Mm-hmm. And so there was no particular caring about it. But in Europe was a huge problem. 20 years, the Americans retire, abandon Afghanistan. Taliban are again there. Mm-hmm. And since more than 2 years now, the Taliban are effectively prohibiting cultivation. They asked me help for this issue, and I realized that they are again very serious in doing that. Mm-hmm. But now I don't agree with them because they are doing it anyway without offering any alternative to the peasants that produce a commodity that is 10 times more rentable than any other. Mm-hmm. And now we are seeing in Europe the first signal of a big heroin shortage. But this is occurring 2 years later because there are huge holder place where they put the heroin before selling it. So this this deposit, huge deposits of heroin, now are being rapidly depleted, and we could soon have in Europe a huge problem of heroin shortage that would potentially affect 1 million of residual consumers.
Right.
This could create an opportunity for opioids coming from the United States to fill the gap. But as I said before, this is not granted. It's not granted because the work we did against drug consumption in the last decades has been effective. There is a huge awareness in Europe about it, and there are no complicity by European doctors that do not prescribe so easily anti-pain drugs like in the United States. This is, in few words, the situation.
No, it's decades of experience. It's hard to summarize in just a few minutes. I appreciate that. I do think that the example of Afghanistan and what was done around the turn of the century is a kind of proof of principle that with the proper restraint methods, but especially with economic development, you can actually address the problem.
Absolutely.
It's a little bit like what Pope Paul VI said about development is the new name of peace. Again, development is the only competent way to fight the international drug trade. As you're probably aware, the Schiller Institute and Executive Intelligence Review have long promoted the idea, for example, for Mexico and Central America, that there should be great development projects to help the peasantry in those regions develop, have high-speed rail, have production, and to address the needs of the population that are otherwise driven into nothing but the drug trade. Same thing for Africa, for Europe, and so on and so forth. So these kinds of great projects become of some significance. So I think that your experience in Afghanistan is a microcosm of what should be a global approach of development as the solution to the drug problem. Is that a fair evaluation?
Absolutely. I believe that we demonstrated that it is possible to put aside, to eliminate the issue of natural drugs, issue that has been on the table for 1 century. We can do it. We can do it, and we can be entirely successful. But when pharmaceutical industry filled the gap, heroin consumption, for instance, even in the United States, was on the point to be quite marginal, decreased a lot when fentanyl entered on the scene. But this was the normal industry, normal capitalism that took the opportunity to make huge profits on that. So we have the tools to understand the situation. And we have potentially the tools to reduce to a bare minimum or to almost eliminate this issue. There are also, of course, it's a fight that never ends because there are also alternative way to skip the reality, even without the use of chemicals and natural drugs. And maybe in the future, this will be the biggest challenge, the creation of alternative worlds that entirely virtual. But I mean, one problem at a time. And our experience in fighting natural drugs is not so negative like many people say.
Right. Before we actually conclude, and I will ask you for any closing thoughts that you might care to share with the audience of EIR, I would ask our viewers to subscribe to this channel, to like this show, to share it around, and go to EIR.news to purchase subscriptions, $10 a month for the subscription to the Daily Alert, $50 per month for the full services, including extraordinary interviews like what we're having right now with Professor Arlacchi, which are simply not available in other places. Your final thoughts, anything? Yeah, go right ahead. Your final thoughts.
No, I say these problems are created by us, by human beings, and there are no human problems that cannot be solved by human people themselves. This is an old story, an old saying that by Antonio Gramsci that I share entirely.
I share your optimism. I think this can be done. I really appreciate that sense that we have the tools, as you said. We can, in large measure, eliminate drugs. And I think that sense of optimism about solving the world's problems as a whole is what's most urgently needed to actually make sure that those problems are solved. If one starts from pessimism and a sense of no can do, then we will ultimately be defeated. But if we approach it with a scientific sense, with a sense of commitment to humanity, and with a sense that this can be done, we can, I am convinced, at long last, finally win the opium war, which was unfortunately only suspended for a period of decades and centuries. Professor
Just
Arlacchi?
conclude with another very famous Gramsci saying, we must have the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will if we want to overcome this problem, which is a drug problem, it's a big problem, important problem, but there are bigger issues that have been faced and solved. And but this can do that in another interview. Like China, for instance, got rid of poverty, which is an issue that is 10 times bigger than narcotics. They had the pessimism of intellect. They did plans extremely effective and detailed, and they, in 40 years, got rid of poverty in the country, which is a much, much bigger problem than drug consumption and trafficking.
Absolutely. 850 million people over 40 years, down to zero.
Down to zero.
Two-thirds of the world's elimination of extreme poverty came from China. The entire world owes China a debt of gratitude because this affects the entire world economy in a positive way.
And no one thought it was possible to do. No one.
Exactly. Okay, so we have the theme for our next interview. I accept your invitation for us to invite you to come back. I appreciate your participating in this, your support for EIR, and we look forward to talking to you again. Thank you very much, Professor Arlacchi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Very much.